One of my favorite hobbies is going out and exploring old abandoned buildings. Of course, that sort of thing just breeds scary stories. I used to explore in more urban areas, but they're not nearly as fascinating as old rural buildings. I belong to several groups that like to explore these sorts of old areas. Members would often suggest to others the locations of cool abandoned buildings, so they can be further explored and experienced. The strangest thing I ever explored was not actually a building though. This occurred in a rural area in Maine. The area is actually very good for exploring, as there are tons of abandoned barns and all sorts of old buildings out there. I was looking for one of these old barns when I lost track of where I was. I'm not sure how much you know about Maine, but it has a very large amount of forested area. It's definitely not the kind of place you want to get lost in. I'd also never really gotten lost like this before, at least not as significantly as I was that day. As I wandered around the woods, I thought my main goal should be trying to locate this particular barn. I knew the way to get there, so arguably if I found it, I should be able to deduce my way back out of the woods from there. I didn't find it as I was wandering though. I found something even stranger. I found what appeared to be a set of random old cellar doors. There was no building or even an old foundation around, as far as I could tell. It was just a random pair of cellar doors set in the ground. I began thinking that maybe me getting lost was a good thing. When I did get out of here, I would have a good story to tell all the others. I could see right away there were no locks on the doors. For some reason, they were a bit hard to get open though. When I finally did, I was surprised they didn't fall apart altogether. The steps led down into a really dark and dank area that I couldn't see in at all. I took out my flashlight and slowly entered this cellar. Walking down those stairs was quite a freaky experience. They creaked and bent under every step from my weight. I had no idea where they were leading, other than to an underground area. The cellar was quite interesting. I can't even really begin to describe it. It had an earthen floor, wooden support beams, and shelves made up the majority of the walls. Surprisingly, there was even an old bed laid up against one of them. There was also a table that was cluttered with various objects. Walking over to the table, I soon got the shock of my life. There were two things laying on top I would have never expected. One thing was the decayed remains of what was clearly a human hand. That was freaky enough, but the far scarier thing was a newspaper that was dated from only 3 days ago. That meant that not only was someone keeping a decaying human hand around, but they had recently been in that cellar. Shocked, I immediately went back to the stairs and tried to make my way out of that area. I almost expected one of the weak stairs to break under my weight as I hurried back up the steps. I got to the top and looked all around to see if anyone was watching. I quietly closed the door and hurried back into the woods as quickly as I could. The walk back was very nerve-wracking. I know it's cliché to tell you this, but I thought every sound I heard was the inhabitant of that cellar coming back. I had no idea if they were directly responsible for whatever events led to someone losing their hand, but I certainly didn't want to stick around to find out. It took me 2 hours to find my way back to my vehicle. It was completely dark by the time I got there. I was so on edge that I had to check the back seat of my car for intruders. I even looked under my car. That's how unnerved I was. That was the last time I ever went exploring in that area. My parents bought an old house when I was 10 years old. My dad had gotten a really good job and wanted to buy a bigger place for us to move into. The house was quite huge. It was old as well, but kept in a really good condition. It was so big that all of us kids even got our own room. We had a huge attic to keep all of our storage. In this house was also a very large and dark basement. It was completely empty though. The really interesting thing about the basement though was a small door located on one of the walls. It was locked when we moved in, and my dad had never been given a key for it. We had no way to open it. That little door became something of a fascination for me, my brothers, and my sisters. My dad tried to tell us, don't let your imaginations run wild now. He said it was likely just a small room that had tools in it, or maybe it had nothing at all. Yeah, telling us not to let our imaginations run wild, that pretty much just ensured that was the very thing that was going to happen. Growing up, we all used to tell all sorts of stories about what could possibly be behind this mystery door. My brother said it was a room that children would hide in when their parents were angry and fighting, like some sort of child panic room. The others all had their own ideas about what it could have been, but I don't want to bore you with all that. From age 10 to 16, I would have never considered trying to break down the door or trying to pick the lock or anything. I wasn't scared of my dad, but I knew that if I broke into it after he repeatedly insisted we don't, he would be pretty angry with me and I'd get in a lot of trouble. It was when I was 17 and I was home alone that I finally found out what was in that room. My family was all out of town and I had a few friends over. After a lot of horsing around, my buddy began talking about the door. We all got really curious, and he kept insisting I try and get it open. I refused at first, telling him my dad would get very angry with me. When that didn't work, I told him the door was much more interesting when we didn't know what was really in there. That didn't work either. None of my excuses seemed to faze my friends, and I had to admit, I really wanted to know what was on the other side. We all snatched up some tools and decided to go open it up ourselves. I won't go into too much detail explaining how we did it, although it did take quite a long time to get through. Finally though, we did get to the other side, where I saw the weirdest thing I had ever seen in my life. It was an extremely small room. I mean, I would have been too big at that age to even fit into myself. There was no lighting, so I had to use a flashlight to see around. There were what seemed to be words scrawled all over the walls. They were smeared with either blood or red paint. I told myself it was red paint. However, the decaying corpses of several birds and small animals were laying in a disgusting pile in the corner of this small room. That indicated that maybe these red smears on the wall could be bird blood. The weirdest thing though was there was a small child-sized rocking chair facing the far wall of the tiny room. There appeared to be a doll on the chair. Turning the chair around, I saw the doll was covered with what I assumed to be bird crap. Its eyes had been ripped out of their sockets, and they had been filled with blood that had long since dried. It had scratches on its face and rips in its clothes. It was missing both of its legs, below where the knees should have been. It was a freaky thing and pretty damn weird to just stumble upon. I didn't take anything out of the room. I closed and relocked the door because I didn't want my dad to get angry at me for opening it. That discovery created so many questions though, that to this day I have no answers to. The weirdest thing of all was it made me more uncomfortable than I had been previously when I had no idea what was behind that door. I remember growing up in the 1980s and having things so different than they are right now. My family didn't even have air conditioning back then. It seems so basic nowadays. There also wasn't as much to do inside. There wasn't a proliferation of video games or movies or TV shows. I think about 5 people in the entire world had the internet back then. Summer vacations were often very dull because of this, and always pretty hot and sweaty too. When I was 13 years old, I began hanging out with a guy named Jack. He was a bit more daring than I ever was. One night, we were deep into summer break and watching some movies on our newfangled VCR or whatever it was called, as well as completely sweating our butts off. On this hot summer night, Jack had a sudden idea. He thought the two of us could go down to the local swimming pool, hop over the gate, and cool off inside. While I didn't really enjoy the idea of trespassing, it wasn't too difficult for him to convince me. It was about midnight when we finally arrived at the pool. It was completely dark out, and the fence surrounding the pool was decently high. It wasn't anything a couple of teenage boys would have a problem figuring out though. Jack and I quickly scaled the fence and set ourselves down in the pool area. Our local pool had a tendency to get very busy during the day, so having it all to ourselves was quite a surreal experience. We were already in our swimsuits, so we quickly jumped into the water. It felt so much better than I can even begin to explain. Jack and I had a lot of fun at the pool. We did cannonballs, blasted a lot of water around, and just had a great time. After a while, I dared Jack to do something that neither of us had ever had the courage to do. I dared him to jump off the highest diving board. I could kind of tell he didn't really want to, but as I mentioned, Jack was more of the adventurous type than me. He eventually gave in with pressure, and I stayed at the opposite end of the pool. My back was to the pool building, where the showers were, and the entrance to the pool as well. Jack slowly climbed up to the top of the ladder. He was watching his feet the entire time, not really looking in my direction. I could tell he was scared going up there, but he was trying his best not to let on. Once he got to the top, he slowly began walking out on the board again. His eyes were constantly on his feet, and he wasn't really paying attention to me at all. It wasn't until I yelled at him, daring him to just do it, that he finally looked up from his feet and over at me. It was hard telling from such a distance, but Jack suddenly looked very alarmed and almost downright scared. He made a motion towards me, but then slipped on the board and fell into the water. Fortunately, he fell forward and didn't hit any part of his body on the pool's edge. He did hit the water pretty hard though. I immediately began swimming for my friend. He didn't resurface very quickly, but fortunately for him, I was the best swimmer I knew. I dived down and found him struggling to swim back to the surface. I grabbed on and pulled him back up and out of the water, dragging him onto the cement. Jack was panicked, but that made sense because he'd just had a pretty harrowing experience. I soon learned though that wasn't why he was so on edge. He jumped up to his feet, went to grab his shoes and shirt, and told me to get mine as well. I hesitated, not exactly sure what had Jack so excitable. He yelled at me to do what he told me right now. I did so quickly. We went to the fence, and I cut myself on a barb this time as we jumped over. Jack jumped from the top of the fence down to the ground. He twisted his ankle slightly, but that didn't stop him from running. When we finally got back to my place, Jack finally told him what caused him to fall and be so alarmed when he looked at me. He'd seen a man approaching me silently from behind, holding what looked like a small hatchet. The man had emerged from the showers and was only a few steps away from me, raising his hatchet to attack when Jack had fallen in. That caused me to immediately swim away from the man. When I pulled him out, the man was not there anymore. He thought he saw the man hiding in the shadows of the room though, waiting for us to go through it. Regardless, he wanted to get over that gate and out of that place immediately. Normally, I might not have believed him. It seemed like such an outlandish story. I mean, why would this random guy with a hatchet be in the locker room of the local swimming pool at that time? But even 30 years later, he maintained it was absolutely true. And the reason I believe him is that my buddy is not the type to get scared of much of anything. Decades later though, this story still freaks him out the very same as that night, so I'm pretty sure he's telling the truth. I bought my first home about 10 years ago. It was a townhouse with 3 stories and a basement. I also had a tiny fenced-in backyard. I wasn't really great at meeting new people, so I really didn't know how to go about introducing myself to the neighbors. I didn't really have to make the first introduction though. I was in the backyard getting ready to give the very small lawn a mowing when I heard someone behind me call out to me. After a brief startle, I turned around and noticed a man, maybe in his mid-60s, standing in the backyard of the adjacent house. We made pleasant introductions and the usual neighborly small talk. I told him where I was from and what I did for a living. He told me how long he'd been living in the house he owned and what the neighborhood was like. It was a very friendly talk. However, strangely enough, he asked me, "Did you hear about what happened in your basement?" I had no idea what he meant by that. I told him the basement was completely fine, but he insisted and asked if I had heard what happened in it. I told him no and asked for him to elaborate. Instead, he shook his head and told me it would be a good idea to talk to my realtor for the whole story. Apparently, they're required by law to tell me those sorts of things. He didn't want to get into it himself. Looked like it was something unpleasant he didn't want to talk about. It was quite a weird experience, but I tried not to think too much about it. Even if something had happened in my basement, that was all in the past. I wasn't too worried about it, and thus I did not call my realtor, nor did I ever talk to my neighbor about it again. He didn't bring it up again either in the couple of months after I'd moved in. An odd experience took place one night though, when I had some family over to see the house. We had a small barbecue in the backyard. The neighbor that had told me about the basement initially, his name was Mike. He was over as well, hanging out with me. He did not bring up the basement at all once again. I guess he felt that whatever had happened was just between me and the people who sold me the house. After everyone had left after having stayed up late drinking beer together and talking, I was still in the backyard cleaning everything up. It was dark outside, but I had a nice patio light that kept the place looking really good. I was cleaning up the grill facing the house when suddenly something caught my eye. I quickly glanced over at the basement door, where I very distinctly saw the face of a young lady pressed up against the window of the basement. This person was clearly watching me as well. I was so startled I literally fell backwards on my butt. Despite that, I looked back at the door and distinctly saw this lady watching me and following me with her eyes. After a few moments though, the person turned away from me and appeared to walk down the basement stairs on the other side of the door. I didn't have my cell phone on me. The basement wasn't accessible from the house either, so I didn't have to worry about someone sneaking into my home or something. I ran up the stairs to my back door, got on the phone and called the police about the incident. I kept an eye out the back window to see if the lady had at any point tried to leave. I didn't see her doing that though. The police soon arrived and I gave them the basement key. They went down there and found nothing out of the ordinary. One of the officers even copped a bit of an attitude with me, thinking I knew the history of the house and that I was playing a prank on them. I had no idea what they were talking about. It was then explained to me that 20 years ago, the house was empty. A woman in the neighborhood had been kidnapped while out on a jog and kept in the basement. When someone finally broke in, she was unfortunately found dead down there. I was unaware of any of this, however. Many people in the town knew about it, so they may have just been playing a prank on me. I don't know, but I never saw anyone in the basement ever again. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here as always. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you do subscribe, be sure to hit that bell button and turn notifications to all so you can be notified whenever I post a new video. I try to post every night, so if you don't feel like doing that, you can come back and check every night around 5:30 p.m. and there should be a video for you. If you guys have any criticism or any thoughts on the stories therein or anything like that, please be sure to leave a comment. I always make sure to read every comment. Even though I can't always respond to them, I do read each and every one and I do enjoy them, so please continue to leave your guys' comments. If you'd like to send in your own story for me to read, please be sure to check in the description below the video. It will have links to my Twitter, Gmail, and Facebook accounts. Send me a message on any of those and I'll try to read your story as soon as possible. If you do decide to send a story in, please be sure to include the tagline, what the name of the story is, what the type of the story is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. And of course, there's a link to my friend Killer Orange Cat's channel in the description. He lets me use some of his stories in my videos, so if you could be so kind, please be sure to check him out as well, as he's also a good scary story narrator. Overall though guys, I think that's pretty much it for now, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.